next up, I would like to invite Frank Chaparro, who will moderate the talk with Jelena Djuric, the CEO of Noble, and the topic will be, of course, Cosmos. Please give them warm welcome.
Oh no, this is tall.
Don't fall.
This is too tall for me. All right.
Well, thanks everyone for taking the time. We're going to talk about why this whole thing matters. And I'm very excited to have the conversation with you. You've been in the Cosmos ecosystem since 2020. I'm kind of jealous of you because I've had the same job for the past 5 years, which is relatively boring, but you've been at Dfinity. You obviously are now running Noble, which we can talk a little bit about. You spent some time also at Cello. So how did you get here? Walk us through your journey.
Yeah, so, I mean, how far back do we go? I always like to go back kind of BC.
The embryonic stage.
The embryonic stage. So, you know, it was a warm summer night in Toronto, Ontario. No.
Yeah.
My parents, no. So I've been in the crypto ecosystem for the past 6 years. Dfinity was my first project that I got involved with. Dfinity was one of the original sort of kind of quote-unquote Ethereum killers that a lot of people kind of were excited about. They raised a lot of money. There's a lot of kind of enthusiasm. They also, from a technical perspective, definitely innovated a lot around, you know, just their kind of smart contracting environment and things like this. But I always found Dfinity and kind of the vision to be very insular. And I think we can talk a little bit about what that means for Cosmos and how Cosmos is this, you know, permissionless sort of open source environment that really prioritizes sovereignty and permissionless interoperability, you know, versus things like kind of like other ecosystems. So anyways, I was at Dfinity for a few years, was part of the early team that led a lot of the kind of adoption around the Dfinity kind of virtual machine, what became the internet computer. And then eventually I went to Cello, which is another really interesting project. I was there for a few months, got to meet the early validator community. We, you know, did a lot of really interesting things there, and then eventually went to Cosmos. And I was always a very big fan of the vision. I remember at Dfinity in our offices in Palo Alto, we were watching like when the Cosmos Hub launched in 2019. We were all sort of like watching it from our computers. So yeah, it feels like this is a natural place to be.
So walk us through what Noble is building out.
Yeah, so Noble actually started about a year ago. So there were a lot of problems that we've been facing, I mean, generally in the crypto ecosystem, but specifically in Cosmos. So we had Terra, which collapsed, went to zero, and Noble was really a response to sort of that event. And in the sense that we very quickly saw that we didn't have a lot of institutional adoption or kind of partners in the Cosmos ecosystem, right? We didn't have native stablecoins other than UST, which went to zero. And so a lot of these things, I think, became kind of like a tipping point for us. And we realized if we're going to be, you know, kind of world class and have a lot of adoption, we need to have these sort of partners, you know, in the ecosystem that can kind of like be reliable and
not blow up.
Not blow up. Yeah, I mean, you know, it's interesting. Like Terra was this incredible experiment. I think like—
You mentioned at breakfast that the Wall Street Journal reached out to you about it once they figured out that it was tied to Cosmos.
Well, you know, you mentioned even for yourself, like you didn't necessarily realize that Terra was a Cosmos project.
I blocked it out from the trauma.
Yeah, and I mean, it's probably for the best, right? Because it was a very like negative association. And it's funny, when the Wall Street Journal reached out, and there's been like other sort of media interest recently with obviously Do Kwon, you know, being in jail or like under house arrest. You know, they didn't realize. They're like, wait, so what is Cosmos? Like, how did Do Kwon sort of like start Terra? Like, what is, you know, like what is this like thing that you're talking about? Because a lot of people don't understand that, you know, what Cosmos actually is.
So how do you explain it to them? How do you push the narrative forward past a Terra?
You know, it's a good question. I think that, so, okay. I think a lot of people understand Ethereum, right? They understand that there is this like monolithic base layer, there is like one kind of execution environment, there's like a token, it's called Ether, it's very like valuable, you know, literally like 5 years ago it was like $100 or something like this, right? Cosmos, it's not as recognizable. There is no one sort of monolithic like base layer. There's like no one necessarily execution environment. Every blockchain is sovereign. You have this like app chain thesis. There is no one asset you can necessarily invest in and get exposure to the rest of the Cosmos ecosystem. We tried to kind of fix that a little bit with this Atom 2.0 vision, but at the end of the day, it didn't really pan out. And I think that's entirely purposeful in the sense that Cosmos is essentially this idea of the Internet of Blockchains. It's this idea of sovereignty. It's this idea that any application should run on its own dedicated blockchain. It should have, this kind of independence from the rest of the ecosystem. And so even when things like Terra blew up, it didn't necessarily, halt anything, right? Like Terra obviously blew up and everything halted from that perspective, but, the Cosmos Hub was still running, Osmosis was still running, even though they were severely impacted. So it's this idea that every kind of, it's this idea of sovereign interoperability at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm. But there's a challenge in as much as the value accrual doesn't necessarily go to one token. So it might be difficult or complicated from an investment perspective to sort of find the value in the ecosystem as an institution.
Yeah, and so this, going back to sort of the origin story of Noble. So when we obviously had this like incredibly disastrous event, and I can't emphasize enough how much that kind of changed the landscape. We also at the same time had DYDX that decided, okay, we're going to sort of, we're going to build a Cosmos chain. It's going to be DYDX v4. We're going to migrate from Starkware to Cosmos. And we sort of realized, you had on the one hand this incredibly, negative event, which was Terra, but then you also had this very positive event, which was this DYDX announcement. And so we decided at that moment we have to be a lot more thoughtful and considerate about how we engage institutions, like Circle and others. Yeah.
So what does that engagement look like?
Yeah, so we're very excited that we're bringing native USDC to Cosmos. So we have a partnership where they will be deploying the asset on Noble, and in the future we are looking forward to also engaging with other asset issuers. So for Circle, it was this very complicated situation where they didn't necessarily know where to kind of issue their asset. There were kind of different options. There were existing kind of DEXs, DeFi protocols where they could issue, but they always wanted somewhere that was a neutral sort of landing spot, also somewhere where they wouldn't necessarily be competing necessarily, with other assets. So at the end of the day, yeah, they chose Noble.
So where do you go from here? What are sort of the vision, the long-term vision of the company?
Yeah, so we're looking towards supporting other assets as well. So we're hoping to issue, I can't necessarily say right now, but other stablecoins, other crypto assets, and we're also just really looking to be that stable, kind of reliable partner to institutions. Yeah.
What type of use cases are these institutions interested in?
So really, they are just looking for a way to kind of reliably, securely, also in a compliant manner, issue their asset, right? So they need to do things like blacklisting. They need to do things kind of maintaining some canonical state for the asset. So we're not necessarily looking to kind of create any marketplace or any sort of application for things like USDC. We're looking to kind of have that be available on other kind of app chains in the ecosystem, whether that's a DEX or a DeFi protocol. So it's really, these institutions are just looking where is a neutral sort of secure landing spot that is central enough that we can issue something like a USDC that is easily interoperable and transferable throughout the rest of the ecosystem.
Got it. Let's take it back to the ecosystem. How do you view Cosmos? Is it a blockchain? Is it a stack? Is it a philosophy?
Yeah.
What's your view?
It's a really good question. I'm almost interested in what the audience has to say about this. Okay, quick.
What do you think?
Show of hands. What do you? What is Cosmos?
Is it a stack? Is it a philosophy? Is it a blockchain? So he agrees, or he thinks philosophy. What do you take?
So I definitely agree with Jahad, and it's definitely something that's a little bit more esoteric than something again like Ethereum or Polkadot or even Bitcoin. I would argue, in the sense that it's not any one thing. So it is more of a framework for social coordination. It's a framework for, of course, deploying applications for building blockchains. But it's also a way to establish these sort of trading relationships and social relationships as well. So in that sense, it's a reflection of the values of a community, whatever values they might hold. So obviously the values of Noble are different than, let's say, the values of Osmosis, although there's obviously, overlapping sort of like, kind of synergies there. But at the end of the day, it's this idea that any kind of community, any entity has the ability to be sovereign, right? It has the ability to build their community in a way that makes sense for them, to build products, obviously to build businesses that are sustainable. And if you choose to interoperate, if you choose to build what is like a trading relationship with another blockchain, another Cosmos chain, another entity, you can do that, but you're not forced to, right? And so there's this idea, like, there's this sort of like meme, it's like the Cosmos urge to be sovereign. Like there's like this like almost like kind of like necessity and like urge to want to have sort of complete sovereignty and control. Control is the wrong word, but sort of ownership and oversight over like the thing that you're building, the thing that you're trying to create, which again is very different than Ethereum, right? When you build a decentralized application, you deploy a smart contract in Ethereum, you're still reliant on the Ethereum network. Like from a consumer perspective, these things, how that kind of plays out is things like rising gas costs and like fees, and like you don't really have like the ability to sort of change that necessarily. As a consumer, you're just kind of reliant on like, on the base layer and how congested it might be and how expensive it might be, or even, even insecure potentially. Whereas in Cosmos, every blockchain is sovereign. You have this idea of application-specific blockchains. So it's this idea that at the end of the day, you are kind of in control. And I think there's actually a political economic analogy. It's this idea of like countries, right? And like.
Well, what do they say? Blockchains are cities, or countries, right?
Yeah, and I mean, I think Cosmos is the perfect iteration of that in the sense that you have, very distinct entities that are again sovereign and that can create these sort of trading relationships, but if they don't want to, they don't have to. So even with Terra, for example, kind of going back to the original sort of talking point, when that kind of collapsed, yes, it was very disastrous for a while, but we actually are now seeing a lot of the projects that we're building on Terra, like Astroport and Mars and others, they're actually now redeploying elsewhere. So it's this idea that things can sort of break down, they can fall apart, but they can easily be rebuilt because you have these sort of like landing spots and you have these, these places to sort of have safety, have some sense of like security and things like this.
How do we get to the point at which the apps sort of transcend the technology upon which they're built?
Yeah, I mean, we were talking about this at breakfast, but obviously there is, kind of a contentious kind of debate happening right now, where is it strategically beneficial to associate yourself with the Cosmos brand, the Cosmos narrative, or is it better just to build something useful and disassociate from Cosmos and not even really necessarily have to advertise that, right? So we love to say for like a lot of the core contributors, technically Binance Smart Chain, they are leveraging like a fork of Tendermint, technically Crypto.com, same thing. They are actually leveraging the Cosmos stack. I'm not sure if you're
that one I knew.
Familiar. Good. And obviously that's like a good example of like a highly scalable, like high throughput sort of kind of application business built on the Cosmos stack. So we like to say that a lot of these centralized exchanges actually leverage the Cosmos stack, which is definitely a good proof point. But I think at the end of the day, they don't necessarily need association with the Cosmos brand because they have a great audience, and sometimes that actually takes away from your own narrative, right? To kind of associate yourself with something as esoteric and ambiguous as Cosmos. And so there's like a funny thing, I think when you get big enough, it is more strategically beneficial to sort of probably disassociate yourself and say, we're just building something useful that people care about, that people use every day, that that is profitable or whatever it might be. So DYDX, I think, is an interesting example of this, where they've obviously found an incredible product market fit, with their previous iterations of DYDX, and they have a lot of activity and volume, et cetera. So I think they're kind of like in this interesting spot where they've like bet their sort of business on Cosmos, but at the same time, they have this like incentive to not necessarily be super kind of associated from a branding perspective. So what
is the incentive? Why do you think there's an incentive there?
To not, Well, I think because it takes away from the story. And even like people, I think, such as yourself, or people just generally kind of in the mainstream awareness, they have a hard time, I think, reconciling with, like Cosmos with the thing that they're kind of using on a day-to-day basis, right? Like, how does Cosmos fit into this? At the end of the day, it's not something you should even think about. It's just something that should be a delightful experience. Doesn't matter where it's running. It's just a useful thing.
What do you think takes us more to that mainstream level?
Well, I mean, from whose perspective are we talking?
From the perspective of this ecosystem.
Well, we're definitely very confident that Noble will actually bridge this divide right now. In Cosmos, we still don't have very basic things. MetaMask, for example, doesn't support Cosmos app chains. There's actually a really great effort underway that's led by the Skip team to do that, to have MetaMask support a lot of these amazing kind of projects that are building. We don't have institutional grade custody support, things like Fireblocks. We don't have native USDC. We don't have other native assets in the Cosmos ecosystem, things like wrapped Bitcoin, other stable coins. And so really, I think we're at this kind of interesting inflection point in Cosmos where we're very close to actually having this institutional adoption because of these like missing like building blocks that we still don't have.
How do you accelerate that?
How do you accelerate that? Out of necessity and brute force? I mean, I think like at the end of the day, when there is so much demand for things like, like MetaMask or things like, like stable coins and things like a lot of liquidity kind of coming in, I think it just sort of inevitably happens. However, I would say like more concretely, it's very interesting. There's been like kind of trading blocks that have kind of established that sort of band together to like negotiate for things like MetaMask support and things like Fireblocks support. So for example, you have various projects kind of coming together in these like big Telegram chats that, again, are all independent. They're, whether they're a DEX or a DeFi protocol or even like an asset issuance chain, like a Noble, coming together and like negotiating with like Fireblocks and with MetaMask and other institutions to say, hey, we really want you to support all of us, not just one project, but all 55, Cosmos chains or whatever the number might be today. And, it's very powerful. It's kind of like a free trade agreement or some sort of like political kind of negotiation where we all want this like one same thing, right? We might be competing with each other, might not be competing with each other, but regardless, we all need MetaMask. We all need native landing spot in Cosmos that, again, we don't have a token. We're not looking to compete with like from a DeFi perspective. We're also going to be leveraging the security of the Cosmos Hub, which is the Atom token, which is a relatively high market cap asset. And then also from like a regulatory perspective, right? Like they don't necessarily want to issue on like a DEX or again, something like this. And so there are multiple reasons, but I would say like from a regulatory perspective and security and also just genuinely building something that is like custom built and purpose built with like their needs in mind. And we've also like leveraged other open source kind of software like Osmosis, for example, built the Token Factory, which is the way that you mint, burn, blacklist, et cetera, assets. So we've also greatly benefited from the work of other projects.
And other partners with whom you're speaking, what do those conversations look like? Do they have similar concerns? Or do they see the benefits in a similar way to Circle?
Yeah, it's definitely been an interesting exercise to kind of like reiterate that narrative with other issuers. I think we're still like in the early days of kind of confirming, well, we're both like early and also late in the sense that we haven't confirmed other issuers yet, but we're late in the sense that we're about to prove the model with native USDC. So yeah, I think like a lot of these arguments resonate, and I think the more and more we see projects like either like relaunching in Cosmos or like net new projects with like a lot of volume, a lot of demand, I think issuers will naturally just want to come to Cosmos, and Noble is just a natural spot to land.
What sort of KPIs or metrics would define success in this relationship?
I think that is actually very dependent on just success of the entire Cosmos ecosystem in general. Like the way that we talk about Noble is Noble does not succeed if the rest of the ecosystem doesn't succeed. So having, again, like these very like kind of blue chip projects like DYDX coming in, having a lot of this interchain activity, being able to easily go from one DEX to another DEX, one DeFi protocol to an NFT platform, having that kind of experience, that interchain kind of user experience being solid, is a huge success. And at that point, Noble also succeeds from the perspective of kind of overall kind of increase in interchain activity. So this is something that we're looking forward to. I think like going back to the topic of like our chat, like why this matters. I do think we're at an inflection point, kind of going back to kind of earlier like discussion, in the sense that very much kind of reorganizing, creating these like partnerships, creating these like quote unquote trading blocks to get the MetaMasks of the world, to get the institutions of the world to kind of recognize Cosmos and recognize like what's been built to date and how far I think we can go when it comes to like genuine adoption. You know, I think we sometimes have a chip on our shoulder, like especially a lot of the early contributors, in the sense that so much of like what we're seeing in other ecosystems around like app chains and like, you know, kind of interoperability, Cosmos pioneered. And so we've always been in this interesting position where we have like contrarian takes to general kind of like the way things are developing, but then like 3 years later, it's no longer contrarian, it's actually just like the de facto standard. So yeah, I mean, what are the metrics? Overall, you know, transaction volume within the larger interchain, overall kind of net new kind of institutions kind of coming in, whether those are asset issuers, whether those are custody providers, et cetera. These are all kind of, you know, metrics that will just, you know, rising tide lifts all boats, kind of benefit everybody. So yeah, that's what I would say.
So how do you juxtapose sort of what Cosmos is doing with some contenders in the app chain space?
That's a really good question, because obviously we had, you know, Base, for example, kind of launch as like quasi app chain, which you know, you guys have done fantastic reporting on. You know, I think that as long as you have sort of connectivity between like these different ecosystems, whether that's, you know, kind of like the Optimism ecosystem and like maybe like Polkadot and Cosmos, we do believe IBC will extend far beyond just Cosmos, kind of Cosmos chains. I think that at the end of the day, that will greatly benefit, you know, our ecosystem as well. So seeing more and more app chains come to light, whether they are built on a layer 2 or even on Cosmos, is actually, I would say, beneficial for all of us. But it's interesting, again, this is like a contrarian thesis where a lot of people, I think, doubted the app chain thesis, you know, in like other, like the Ethereum ecosystem and the layer 2 ecosystem, but now you see like a Coinbase taking this like crazy leap of faith, so.
Do you think it'll work?
I'm not going to go on the record on that.
Is this being recorded?
Yeah. What do you think? You shouldn't have an opinion.
I don't have any opinions. So what are you most excited for in the next 6 months?
Well, native USDC going live. I mean, this has been like over a year in progress. Obviously, that, you know, there's a meme at this point, like when USDC, and I'm, you know, mainly the one having to kind of answer that. So we're hoping, I mean, within the next 6 months, that it should happen. Definitely excited for the DYDX v4 migration. We're also very excited to actually support, you know, the cross-chain transfer protocol that Circle is building as well on Cosmos. So hopefully within the next 6 months that should happen. A huge, huge thing I'm really looking forward to is also Noble migrating to interchain security. So leveraging the security of the Cosmos Hub, which we didn't talk too much about, but really aligning ourselves with that ecosystem is very important for us. So again, this is more from the Noble perspective, but that's what I'm looking forward to, yeah.
Well, fantastic. Well, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you, Frank.
Thank you, everyone, for listening in. Really appreciate it.